Brothers podcast, a Five Pillars of Mad Monolith production.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and foes, and welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Didi Hussein. Today's guest, what do I say about today's guest? Today's guest is perhaps the most requested guest that we've had on the Blood Brothers podcast. On every other post, on every other YouTube video or social media, you'll see this guest's name tagged. And the fact that he kept man waiting for 13 months also is mad as well, yeah? And that's none other than rapper, activist, and political commentator Kareem Dennis, who's better known as his stage name Low Key. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Firstly, bro, I wanted to publicly apologize for that. I appreciate your patience. Now, I appreciate your patience, man, because this 13 months is a long time. But also, I wanna big up everyone that has requested an interview like this. As you will know, probably as well as, if not better than me, YouTube now is not the YouTube of 2010 to 2016. You have certain discourses being algorithmically disadvantaged in major ways. I think it's actually quite a bit harder now for an independent artist to get people on YouTube following their music. 70% of what we watch on YouTube is stuff that's recommended to us rather than stuff that we have purposely sought out. So if there is people seeking out my stuff on YouTube as we speak, I massively appreciate it, and it's important to what I do that connection is still there. So yeah,
Nah, bro.
thank you.
Love for that, but there's no need to apologize. All good things come to those who wait, and I think the 13-month anticipation for having Loki onto the podcast was a big thing. So love to you for giving us that time, bro.
Thank you, my bro. Thank you. I appreciate it, bro.
Right, listen, we're going to be talking about some serious issues today, and I want to set the tone for today's podcast by having a session of quick-fire questions, right? Now, there's going to be 2 rounds of quick-fire questions, and basically what I'm going to do, Kareem, is I'm going to mention, round 1, I'm going to mention to you some figures, historical and contemporary figures from Islamic/Middle Eastern history. And I want you to tell me the first thought that comes into your mind.
Okay.
Yeah?
But by the way, don't necessarily expect me to know everybody you mentioned, bro.
That's
I'll tell you
absolutely
if I
fine.
don't.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I mean, if you don't know someone, that's fine. So let's do this. You ready? The first thought that comes to your mind. Let's go. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Social justice.
Fatima al-Fihri.
Quite an important achievement, I think, to be emphasized to young people in schools today, especially in Britain, where a lot of people are being encouraged, and not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector now, to spy on Muslim children, for them to have a good understanding that one of the oldest still existing schools was founded by Fatima al-Fihri. This is an important thing, especially for young Moroccans as well. I live in Ladbroke Grove, a lot of Moroccans here. I think that having a sense of connection to that educational achievement and that societal progress is something that can be inspiring for a lot of people. So I think they should definitely check out what she was able to do, and it's still standing today, so go and check it out too in Maghreb.
Salahuddin al-Ayyubi.
Inspiring and important figure. One that always stood out to me is more an anecdotal story, and it's actually there's differences on whether it did or didn't happen. It was when he met personally with who they called Richard the Lionheart, and Richard the Lionheart took his sword and started smashing it against the tree to knock down the tree, to prove how powerful his sword was and how powerful he was as an individual. Now, what Salahuddin al-Ayyubi did was he threw up a piece of silk and it landed on his sword, and the silk split And I think to me, it fed into a little bit of the martial arts study that I've done in my life, and Bruce Lee's idea of be like water, and the idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and you don't always need to apply pressure in an obvious way, and there are ways in which you can passively defeat your opponent. So I think definitely another important figure to look at and study for sure, and someone I wish I'd studied more of. You know, it's only bits and pieces that I've been able to get in with. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, important guy.
Mansa Musa.
Mansa Musa. I mean, clearly an ostentatious, elitist figure who would have been served by a lot of people who would have been struggling and would have had to serve him in what were probably bondage-like conditions, though I don't know for sure about the details of all of that. But yeah, at one point, the richest man in the world, obviously, at a time where Mali had a monopoly on salt, which was a lot more expensive then than it is now. So yeah, interesting figure for people to learn about. Also, you know, a lot of the figures that we look at in the past, we're juxtaposing them to a present situation where people are viewed as downtrodden and their history is viewed as beginning with colonialism. Now, the importance of bringing up these figures is actually to say there was a history prior to colonialism, and
Absolutely.
even the practice of Orientalism, you know, wasn't. If you look at somebody like Adelard of Bath, or Robert of Chester, or even Roger II, King of Sicily, these were people that in order to develop their societies, they had to learn Arabic and study geography, astronomy, philosophy in Arabic in order for them to develop European society at that time. You know, we know that Muslims were obviously practicing ablution, but more than that, someone like Ibn Sina was able to write a series of books that was used as a curriculum for medicine at a time when Oxford scholars were saying bathing was just a heathen practice and you shouldn't do it. And I'm not saying that to make anyone feel bad. I'm not saying that to I'm not saying that to make anyone feel bad or that anyone should feel ashamed of anything. I'm saying that the development of human history has worked in this way. If you were
Absolutely.
to even look at who, you know, they call the father of astronomy Copernicus, because he had, well, one of his important findings was that rather than the sun rotating around the earth rotates around the sun. That conclusion had been reached by Ibn Shatir 150 years prior to Copernicus seeing that. But obviously Ibn Shatir is not credited in the way that someone like Copernicus is here. So it's about seeing the development of humanity in a more open way and in a way that is less affected by current political antagonisms and power dynamics, I would say.
Cool. Abdul Qadir Al-Jazairi.
Jazairi. A very complicated figure. I think that in a way he is celebrated by Europeans, Western Europeans particularly, for the things that some Algerians may condemn him for. But I think as a symbolic figure, I mean, he reminds me a little bit of Yasser Arafat. As a symbolic figure, he has a political currency. The reason why I mentioned him in the song was because it always struck me the way that he had been buried in Syria, and then after the liberation of Algeria, you know, you have to remember that the French had occupied it since the 1830s until the early 1960s, and they call it Thawrat Million Shahid. So while the figures of how many Algerians died across the period is debated back and forth, you know, the French were using all manner of, and it's one of the reasons actually that I mentioned in the song Idarat al-Tawahush. Now,
Yes.
even saying that can get us on watch lists, because of the importance that some of the ideas in that book seem to have played on,
Yep.
you know, people that went off and hurt a lot of people in Iraq and in Syria. And then became the focus point of the military-industrial complex for a few years, and were a cash cow for the military-industrial complex for a few years.
No.
But my point being is, one of the core understandings in my limited reading of it was the idea of displaying and exhibiting punishment in a way that will affect the population that you are attempting to control or to rule over, in order to get their consent at your rule, consent to your rule. Now, the French were literally sending postcards home from Algeria of French soldiers holding the heads of Algerians. They used to drive Algerians in buses to the mountains to watch executions of people like them. They used to leave people on the side of the road with a kind of a signpost next to them sticking out saying, this is what happens when you mess with the French. That's not to mention the other policies they had of deveiling Algerian women publicly.
Yep.
There were all types of ways in which you can say that, especially that kind of generation of North Africans, but particularly Algerians, you know, we know the civil war in 91 followed the democratic election of a group that weren't to the liking of the Algerian military or to much of the international community. And so all of those things give birth to is a level of brutality that then you will start to see reflected in these kind of movements, especially when people don't see their political aspirations reflected within the framework of the political system. So they see no way in which that, and even when they try to enter the political system, they are suppressed outside of it. They are imprisoned, they are overthrown by the military. And so this type of brutality that we saw, as horrifying as it was, and you know, we're from London, you know, there many people from London also got involved, and there was always a way in which the British media would look at the situation and say, where has this come from? And they try and explain it. And I think the things they brought up might be useful and might contribute to the discussion about it. But I think what also has to contribute to the discussion about it is that period of history before independence and the independence of the nation states that a lot of people were coming from. I think that's an important part to add to the conversation. Hence, the inclusion of that kind of stuff in the song as well.
Cool. Sultan Abdul Hamid.
No, this is not really quick fire, is it?
You're not making a quick fire, but Khair, I'm enjoying the responses. I'm enjoying the responses.
It's all good, bro. I mean, it's mainly thinking out loud. Sultan Abdul Hamid. I assume you mean the last one.
The second. So Khalifa Abdul Hamid the second. Yes.
Yeah, he was an interesting figure. You know, again, I don't want to go into too much depth into all of these guys because I just have not given the reading necessary to have.
I did say initial thoughts, Akhi.
Position. Yeah. Okay, so I'll give you initial thoughts. Naive.
Wow.
Naive.
Really?
Yeah.
Omar Mukhtar.
Yeah. Mukhtar. Inspirational.
Sayyid Qutb.
I've read a bit of Ma'alif Tariq, but I really have not had enough of a serious study of him to give you a serious opinion, but clearly influential.
Wow, so that was supposed to be our round 1 of quickfire, so I'm not even going to call it quickfire anymore, yeah? Round 2, but I swear down, you have to promise me to keep it as brief as possible, yeah?
Okay, bro.
Tell me,
Bro.
just tell me instinctively what comes to your heart and mind, yeah? So we've done figures, let's talk political concepts. Instinctively, what comes to your mind? Democracy. Rah.
Inverted totalitarianism.
Human rights.
Important.
Socialism.
Care.
Free speech.
Relative.
What's widely known or referred to as Islamism.
Eurocentric.
Nation state.
Recent.
Capitalism.
Malignant. Or dynamic, depending on how you look at it.
Civil disobedience.
Important.
Neoliberalism.
The invisible elephant in the room.
Wicked. That was a very interesting, not so quick fire round, mashallah. Right, listen, let's go into now, obviously a lot's been happening, bro. And I know the entire, our news feeds, our social media feeds, our timelines for the last 2 weeks at the time of the filming of this particular podcast, it's been 13 days since the murder of African-American George Floyd by white Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Subsequently, we've had millions take to the streets in the US and beyond. Even in London, we had tens of thousands. And I know many of our black brothers and sisters have, alhamdulillah, they've had, the opportunity to now speak, and they are speaking. But there's, following on from some tweets that you made recently, right? And there's 2 things that I want to address here in light of what's going on in the US, and I want to get your thoughts on it. People are throwing around the concept of institutional racism, but I feel that many don't actually understand what that actually means in manifest, right? You also tweeted something about the prison complex and how in America, the prison complex benefits from institutional racism against African Americans. Shed a bit of light on what institutional Islamophobia is and how it manifests from a systemic point of view. Because what happens, Kareem, is that people will hear certain words and in a well-meaning way, they'll just use these terms without actually knowing what it means, right? Because everyone's saying it, because low-key is saying it, because Akala's saying it, because this person's saying it, because that's saying it, because it sounds trendy, it sounds good. But I don't think a lot of people, on a very simplistic term, understand what it actually means. So give me your thoughts first and foremost on what institutional racism is and how it has affected black Americans from what you have been tweeting about in terms of the prison complex.
Well, I think, bro, we have to have this conversation, go back to the dawn of what we understand to be race. And I think there's a great book called The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, which is not the hyperbolic book that the title might give someone the impression it is. What she points to is the development of social distinction and race as a form of social distinction. While human difference had been something that had been noted throughout history, you had Ibn Khaldun talk about Asabiyya. You had in India a caste system, which, incidentally, I look at the word karma and jihad as walking in opposite directions, but towards a different language. So you look at something like karma, within and my understanding of it, within the context of Hinduism is literally the difference between somebody being born Dalit and Brahman, and that meaning that they are being punished for a previous life, and it will dictate what kind of life they will have, right? And that is karma. But when a person in London uses the word karma, they're talking about 5 minutes ago you said something nasty to someone and then something bad happens to you.
Yep.
So it's a similar but a different kind of meaning from language to language. And I think a similar but different path has been walked for other concepts, especially from Arabic into English in the present time. You know, you could definitely argue that jihad in English is not the same as jihad in Arabic. They're
Absolutely.
totally different concepts and used in different ways. But anyway, my point is that you have these previous forms of determinism. So this is the thing with the caste system in India. This is the thing with somebody like Aristotle and Plato arguing that people were born predetermined, predisposed to slavery, and others were born predisposed to other things. You then have also the expulsion of the Moriscos, which was an important part following the Spanish Inquisition, which was when Ferdinand and Isabella took Spain back from the Khilafah. You had a situation where people were told that if they were Jewish or if they were Muslim, they had to convert to Christianity, or they had to leave. And so during that period, people converted. However, generations of their families going forward were not trusted on an institutional level. And so what that led to was the expulsion of the Moriscos, which was where the grandchildren or great-grandchildren in some cases of people that had converted out of Christianity or out of Islam, out of Judaism or out of Islam into Christianity,
Were still not trusted.
Were still not trusted and were expelled en masse. You know, some estimations put it at about 250,000 people were driven from Spain to Morocco. Now, what's important about this is you have Asabiya, you have caste system, you have this way in which what they took was religion and put it into a person's blood. So they biologized religion with the expulsion of the Moriscos. And so what that meant is these were precursors to what we understand today to be race, a modern concept. And what Nell Irvin Painter points out in this book, and this is the part that book focuses on, is the 17 and 1800s, when you had thinkers like Blumenbach measuring people's skulls and attempting to create a table of categories of human being. And he had about 5 different categories of human being. Now, what she then says is it's only post-Second World War, and it's only around the 60s that the categories of human beings for what we understand to be white people came into one. So you had the Romans invading London in 46 AD and referring to the Celts, people here, as biologically inferior to themselves. Yet aesthetically, as we would understand what white people are today, there wouldn't be a clear difference between a Roman and a Celt potentially. We would collapse them into the same reductive definition of whiteness. And so what she looks at is she looks at the development of the idea of white people as a recent social construct which is meant to distinguish people from one another. Now, the way in which racism comes about is when you give different rights institutionally, legally, to people who are defined by those aesthetics. So a white person in the law has different rights compared to a black person in the law. Now, the reason why Islamophobia can and must be understood as a form of racism is because during the War on Terror period, we have seen one of the core columns of what we understand to be Britishness, which is the Magna Carta, and habeas corpus that you are afforded within the legal system, judged by a jury of your peers, see the evidence that's held against you. People that are Muslim, okay, have had that taken away.
Of course, we had Theresa May who has secret courts. We've not had evidence being presented. We've had people's citizenship being taken in absentia. We've had all of that.
Yeah, you know it. And the important thing is that if you are racialized as a Pakistani male, you are 154 times more likely to be stopped under Schedule 7.
Yep.
In that process, that person is not being asked their religious views until they're detained. So therefore, an aesthetic judgment is being made of that person and they are being detained. So racism being about aesthetics, being about physical, it's like a marrying of culture and biology. And while Islamophobia is not biological determinism, and that's true, racism of the 17 and 1800s was that biologically some people are destined to be one way and other people are destined to be another way. That's not what's happening. You could say it's scriptural determinism, because without any understanding of Asbab al-Nuzul or Nasikh wal-Mansukh or any of these concepts, they take a very, very narrow and the most irrationalizing as possible reading of religious scripture, and then they're even applying it to children as young as 3. The idea that prevent applies to children in nurseries, that children as young as 3 can be questioned by the police without the presence of their family, can only happen because there's a level of determinism that you're looking at that child with, that child is on a conveyor belt towards committing political violence. When we all know, Chris Hunter, expert in terrorism for the British government, says your chances of being anywhere near an act of political violence are 1 in 16 million in this country. Between something like I'll get the figure for you, but the percentage. Well, the percentage of terrorist attacks that were committed by Muslims in Europe between the year 2008 and 2014, I think it was 0.7. But I mean, point is, it's infinitesimal. The chances, right? You have a better chance. Yuval Noah Harari said it like this. He said, McDonald's and Coca-Cola are a greater threat to your life in the Western world than Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Now, I don't like those personally. I don't like those organizations, yeah? And I'm not saying anyone else does. I'm saying I don't like those organizations. But I don't like Coca-Cola and I don't like McDonald's either. But let me tell you something. Merely for having this conversation in this way, this video, you don't know what can happen to this video on YouTube. You don't know who could say this is a post that is doing. Look at YouTube standards in terms of
absolutely, bro.
In terms of censorship and stuff like that. Yuval Noah Harari is a best-selling Israeli author. He wrote *Sapiens*. This is somebody who is as embraced by the establishment as is possible, and the implication of his words is that there must be Islamophobia within the society if we're treating these two organizations as anywhere near akin to the damage done by obesity and the damage done by food, which is bad for your health, in terms of actual data, in terms of people that die linked to those things. So it's about threat inflation. That's the truth. It's about threat inflation. And how does that connect to what's happening in the States?
Exactly. Yeah. Spot on. Carry on. That's exactly what I was getting at. Go on. How does that relate to what's happening in the US?
So now, what we understand to be the cultural ambience of the moment is the commonsensical way in which it's normal for somebody that works in Superdrug or Tesco or McDonald's to be on the lookout for extremism, despite the fact that Mark Sageman in Misunderstanding Terrorism says that in the war on terror period, according to the prosecutions, you're talking about less than 1 in every million Muslims having anything to do with political violence, despite the fact that around 80% of the 160 or 70 people in prison now on terrorism charges are people in prison for non-violent crimes, right? Despite the fact that all of that is the norm, yeah? That level of hyper anxiety about a section of the population is the norm. What that means is that you have a situation of racists without racism. Profound racism without racists. You have the situation where people can say, well, but that's just the way things are. The system is structured in such a way that lends itself to the reproduction of that situation. Now, what you have in the States is African Americans making up 13% of the population, but making up 40% of the prison population. Michelle Alexander has a great book called The New Jim Crow, and Glenn Greenwald has a good book called The Liberty and Justice for Some, which looks at that discrepancy, that disparity. White, to use the reductive term, Americans are 65% of the population, yet they make about 39% of the prison population. You look at Latinos, they are 16% of the population in the United States, and they make up about 19% of the prison population. So no other group within the United States is as disproportionately represented in prison as African Americans. That's the fact. Now, how that happens is something that there may be different opinions on. There are those that say, look, if you look at the school to prison pipeline and the rates of expulsion that happen for African Americans, it leads to a situation where they only are about 15% of the school population, but 31% of students that are ever arrested are African Americans. 70% of those people that enter prison in the US are people that did not get the chance to finish high school. You know, in the era that we live in after the civil rights movement, a black man has a 60% chance that they will be incarcerated in their lifetime. Now, when you look at the forms of crime that are applied and that lead to that situation, a lot of it is for non-violent crimes around drugs. And when people have campaigned for reforms in the drug laws in the United States, you have had private prison companies. And let's not forget that everything in the prison system within the United States, and it's not, you know, because in fact the majority of prisons in the United States are still owned by the state, but it's the companies that supply the bedding, it's the companies that supply the food, it's the companies that make massive, that extract massive profit from this this economic equation. So those companies, private prison companies, lobby government against reforming drug laws because they know that it's those drug laws that are the big cash cow for them and that keep feeding that that economy. And you know, we don't live in a completely different situation in the United Kingdom. We do have a situation where 88% of young men that are placed in prison were excluded from school at some point, and also 45% of those that enter custody in Britain are black, and 10% of them are Asian. So while it's not the same, while the history of police brutality, the history of New Jim Crow, apartheid is not the same. You know, there were murders in the street like Kelso Cochrane, which led to the Notting Hill Carnival. There was a system of no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, applied in areas after the Windrush period, but it's simply not the same as a long, several hundred years relationship with an apartheid state, which is what the United States was at one point. And so what you have is a situation where people are making something like 86 cents a day in US prisons, but they generate about $60,000 a year for private interest. You have situations where people that may have lost a loved one that are in prisons in the US and will need to go to the funeral will have to pay for the officers that go with them. And so you even have situations where people exit prison in the United States and are in debt. And that debt has interest on it already. So within that situation, the dealing by law enforcement in the US with African American males is an extension of the penal system, which is about converting them into economic units that can serve private interest. Even if you look at the amount of people that are in the US prison system awaiting trial, it's something like 6 out of 10 people in US jails are people that have not been put on trial yet. And even 95% of all jail growth in the US, population growth between 2000 and 2014, was people that were eventually not found guilty anyway. No, I mean people that had not yet gone to trial, actually. So 95% of all jail growth for those 14 years was people that had not gone on trial yet. So I think that what's happening now is important, but I also feel that more in the British context than the United States, because my ability to have any effect on US government policy is very limited, but my ability to say things which will affect people in this country is greater. Gatherings of tens of thousands of people on the street here are not necessarily a great idea.
Why is that?
Because if you are a black man, you are 4.2 times more likely to die from the coronavirus. If you're Bengali or Pakistani, you're 1.8 times more likely to die from the coronavirus.
Karim, we're gonna get to, because that's our next topic of discussion: COVID-19 and BAME communities. But before we move on to that, Akhi, look, at the end of the day, you've just highlighted what I would say is the tip of the iceberg in terms of major disparities in terms of how African Americans are legally, systemically disadvantaged and discriminated towards, right? But the age-old discussion is this, bro, and I guess this goes back to the times of MLK, the times of Ghana and Malcolm X. Is that what's to be done then, bro? Is it a case of engaging with the system to look at reform, legislative reform? Is it a case of uprooting the entire system at its roots? What is it? Because
I think one thing.
Because,
sorry, bro.
No, because at the end of the day, whether it's the Arab Spring, whether it's movements for social change in the global South or in the Muslim majority world or even the US, there's always that age-old discussion about what do people want. Besides going to the streets, what is it that people want? Do you want to uproot the system? Do you want to replace the system? Do you want some legislative reforms? If so, what's the best way to go about that, right? Because once the hype's done, Kareem, once the hashtag's done, right, there is a very likely fear that things will just go back to normal. That there was a little period where people were allowed to vent. That venting period is done, and everything will go back to normal. There is that.
Well,
So what's your thoughts on that then?
Well, there's 2 points here. When we look at history, we see that mass mobilizations of people lead to political systems making concessions that they wouldn't otherwise make in order to try and accommodate that kind of dissent. And so you had reactions to the unrest that led to a black middle class that you didn't really have in that period prior to that kind of unrest. It led to situations where you could have somebody in the White House like Obama, but the actual substance of the policies didn't radically change in the way they needed to. So I completely agree that clarity is needed, especially when you have a lot of people on the streets. When you are at the time of a pandemic, make no mistake about it, the debt that has been incurred by this period of economic shutdown, is not only going to lead to serious austerity. The debts are not going to be treated the way the World War II debt was treated, or the debt from the Emancipation Act in 1833 when they gave 20 million pounds to people that owned human beings and traded in them. The debt is going to be treated more like 2008, and George Osborne has already said we need to get austere to deal with this. Now, the thing about it is one sector which is not going to be subject to that that the same level of austerity as all the other sectors will be police. Because of the social unrest, because of the perceived need to track people, because of the changes in law that we've seen around stuff like testing and tracing, increased surveillance, increased use of big tech companies to see into every orifice of your existence. All of that is going to increase. And I think that is definitely something people need to be careful about. You know, there's a phrase that I have always found quite interesting and quite nice. It is the juxtaposition of what they call optimistic cruelty and cruel optimism. And so on one side, you have the optimistic cruelty of the ruling class, because they say, well, you know, we take these policies, but maybe it won't be that bad. And this is the kind of mantra they repeat to themselves because they don't see it. They're not directly in contact with it.
They're not living
but then
it.
But then the cruel optimism is the other side of it. Is the person who's just trying to get ahead in life in a situation where many different forces and a machine with lots of moving parts is seeking to convert that person into an economic unit, a process which will no doubt traumatize them massively. So I think you're right. That is on the shoulders of the people that are attempting to organize this mass of human beings right now, is to have clarity in aims and to be clear about it. I don't believe that people need to be particularly pure politically. There are different roles that can be played by different people in different positions. I think that the prison system hasn't always been the way it is. I think that it can change, though I would be very careful. You've seen the US Army put out a video just yesterday or the day before yesterday of one of their prominent officers explaining what it's like for him on an individual level as a black man in the United States. Now, this is a very, very sophisticated form of psychological warfare, because what it does is it gets people to feel that vertical solidarity with the army implicitly, because he didn't do it on a private platform. He did it dressed in military fatigues and released through the US military's, the division that he belongs to, that division's Twitter.
We've had the same.
account.
We've had the same with the Muslim Association or Armed Forces in the UK. We've had the same.
Yeah. So this is how it happens. You have Sajid Javid talking about what it was like for him to grow up, encouraging people to implicitly come along with this Ayn Rand individualism, because when you take what are structural and social problems and convert them to merely individual things that relate to how you feel rather than what your relationship with institutions is and what your material reality is, then it's quite easy for you to overlook the relationship with institutions, to overlook the material reality and focus on how it feels. And I think that is a dangerous thing at this moment, is for people to focus on emotionalizing what is a very real issue which does return in many ways to economics. You know, you look at the US incarceration system, some estimates had it that it was 1 in every 100 adults in the United States was in prison around 2008, 2009. If you were to look at the Soviet Union Gulag system, you had something like 0.8 per 100 USSR residents at its height incarcerated in some way.
Madness.
So think about what we're comparing this to, and think about, you know, your situation where, in comparison to its neighbors, the prison rate in the United States is higher than actually every other state in the world.
Yeah.
There's 10.6 million admissions to prison in the United States every single year. There's more people in prison than there are people in the city of Dallas or the city of Philadelphia in the United States. That's a gargantuan amount of human beings. Is that really necessary? Is that really necessary for domestic tranquility? I don't think it is.
That's
I don't
mad.
think it is at all.
So, I mean, look, just before we move on to COVID-19 and things a bit more closer to home in the UK, how do non-black people of colour assist and contribute in aiding their brothers and sisters, whether it be the African Americans, whether it be African Caribbeans here in the UK? What would your advice be to Arabs, Turks, Asians, people, you know, of people of colour who can assist in this struggle?
Okay, so I think, number one, it's definitely worth learning about history. So as an Iraqi, it was interesting to study Thawrat al-Zanuj, quote unquote Zanuj, not a nice word, but it's a word that is used to refer to that particular event in history. I think it's worth studying that, and also what we can see as ways in which there may be similarities with a certain period of time, but let's not forget, and you know, I'm not a scholar, okay? I'm not a scholar, but my understanding is manumission is something that is rewarded Islamically. We know that. We know that manumission, emancipation of somebody in a situation of bondage, was not the same economic transaction that it was in the transatlantic slave trade. What I think is not healthy, and as you will know from an Uthmaniyin, there were a huge amount of people whose parents who were born into some form of bondage who went on to be khulafa.
Yep.
In the Ottoman context. There was also a different kind of dynamic that developed with eunuchs, and it's not the same. And I think that having such a US influence conception of the world can sometimes then be back projected onto history. And I don't think that is a good thing to do. And I think people should be careful about it. I think they should be interested and curious about the history, but they shouldn't necessarily use broad strokes to apply the same situation across the board everywhere in the world.
Let me just interject basically. So basically, look, bro, basically just that point what you've basically made there, for our listeners and viewers, what you're essentially saying, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically, look, within Islamic history and tradition, there is a concept, or has historically been a concept, of slavery and bondage. The Uthmaniyin, who had the concept of eunuchs and, you know, concubine wives who gave birth to khulafa and sultans. Are you basically saying that should not be compared to, or it would be an unfair comparison to the transatlantic slave trade?
Well, it would make as much sense as comparing, you know, Athens at one point was almost 2/3 made up of people in bondage. Roman society is understood to be the most dominated society by people in bondage. Does that mean that all of those societies were the same as transatlantic slavery? Completely not.
Of course not.
You know,
of course not.
Can we forget that the reason for the French occupation of Algeria in 1830s on the French side was to stop people being kidnapped by the Ottomans and put into bondage within the Ottoman Empire at that time. And they were Europeans, and they were white people that were being taken. You know, as you then mentioned, the Mamelukes, the Mamalik, they then, from military slaves, went on to forming their own
Sultanate.
political center of power. So it would be a shame if we were quick to apply the present to the past across the board and the whole of world history. It's not a wise thing to do. In saying that, as I said at the beginning, I do believe that it is important to look at the ways in which human difference, have had a role in people understanding each other. Let's also not forget that Martin Luther King and the Ku Klux Klan both saw the Bible as justification for their political positions. So
That's mad.
the ability for people to interpret religious texts in completely contradictory ways is something that everyone knows only too well and does exist. Now, in terms of really getting to what you were asking me, I think that we need to also be clear that personal self-flagellation is absolutely politically useless. It offers nothing of substance to any situation. Understand where your resources are, understand where your power lies, and understand things that you can do to materially change the situation. It might make you feel good. It might make you feel good to make a broad stroke condemnation of this idea of a culture, but what's that really going to mean to anybody? You know, I think that you'd be better off donating money to the funds which are looking after people who are definitely, you know, the carceral state in the United States is working very hard right now to convert a lot of people into economic units, to increase surveillance, work out the ways in which those things are happening and the ways in which those passages of power can be disrupted in some way from whatever position you are in. Also, I think an important concept that people need to look into is reification, because the point that I was trying to make right at the beginning of this question, and I understand the answer has been very long-winded, I understand that, but the point I was trying to make is that these concepts are subject to change. These concepts are relational and they are variable and subject to change. And historically, they have not always applied and may not and will not always apply and will change. And so therefore, we shouldn't consecrate these ideas of who people are and peg people to these ideas of identity as having domination of who they are. People are defined by what they do. People are defined by what they do, not identities which are imposed on them by the society. The answer to these social distinctions is not to reify them ourselves. The answer to them is to problematize them and look at them critically and try and understand people, not in a deterministic way, but people in terms of what it is that they can contribute to a process of getting to a more socially just situation. So, you know, that's kind of what I think people should think about.
Do you think in terms of priorities, in terms of the most important things that respective communities need to do at a time like this, at a time where there's been mass mobilization in light of George Floyd's murder, that it's not necessarily the right thing, because it is the right thing, but in terms of priorities, in terms of how we know oppressive systems and the echelons of power love pitting communities against other communities, right? As Pharaoh did in his society, is the time now for, let's say, Asians to speak about anti-blackness within their communities, which very much exists, right? No one's denying that. But at a time where there's anti-blackness amongst Arab societies, right? Is the time right. We're not saying that is the issue right. Of course, it's wrong. It's haram.
The time, I think the time is always right. I just don't believe that making yourself center stage as somebody that is disavowing these things is necessarily very useful. Like I don't think it's bad. I just don't think it's necessarily very useful. But in answer to your question, yeah, of course, absolutely. Talk about it, bring it out, think about why it is, think about what it's linked to, look at the precursors that exist, look at what the trajectory of it is. Because listen, bro, are we pretending, right, that a place that has the history of division, both politically and in a majorly violent way, like India, that then leads to 3 different states, has merely just uncritically imported some form of US racism towards black people?
Of course not, bro.
Obviously not.
Of course not, bro.
Obviously not. Like
I can tell you that as a Bangladeshi, of course, that's not the case.
Exactly, and the extent to which, let's talk about, and I was going to get into it in your question later on about, but let's also then apply it in a global way in terms of this crisis. The remittances, the amount of money that people are sending home has dropped 20% and is basically projected to drop 23%. Now, in that situation, you have to ask yourself, who is it that is going to bear that burden on a global level? If you are in a country like South Sudan, where over 30% of the GDP comes from money that is coming from remittances that are being sent home from family members working elsewhere. If you're in Egypt, where remittances are worth $27 billion a year, or Nigeria, where they're worth something like $24 billion a year, or if you're in somewhere like the Philippines or Haiti, where the GDP is massively reliant on those things, the burden of this situation, of this economic shutdown, is going to kill people across the world because of that change in remittances being sent. So let's also, in the spirit of internationalism, apply that on a global scale. This idea also of what is and what isn't the Arab world. Do you consider as part of the Arab world, and I'm not asking you, I'm asking the question to the viewer, the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of laborers that are living in the Gulf and sleeping 20 people to a room, a lot of them having their passports confiscated from them, being in situations where they're working 18, 19 hours a day, where they're building stadiums, where they're doing all these really important things that are going to economically benefit people that have been told that having a trade union membership is illegal, that going on strike will get you deported. People that actually the British advised the Gulf rulers in the 70s that they should look at taking people from parts of India that had no history of collective bargaining for labour in order to have this kind of uneven and unequal relationship with them. Are those people included in our idea of the Arab world? What about, it's just come out the story about Ethiopian domestic workers in Lebanon who have a much, much higher chance of falling victim to abuse within the homes that they're working. The Ethiopian embassy was taking the money that they were meant to be sending home as remittances and keeping it. So huge amount of money was going. Are those people included in our concept of what the Arab world is? What about Mauritania? Is that included? Is Malta, because they speak a form of quasi-Arabic, are they included in the Arab world? Is Somalia, because it's included in the Arab League, part of the Arab world? What about the people that speak Swahili, Sawahil, from the Arabic word? Their language is full of Arabic. Are they included in our conception of the Arab world? Yes, I believe in thinking of all of these things. What I don't believe is that by making it about you and about you as the person who is disavowing backwardsness and is disavowing a culture which you're basically transposing US racism onto is useful to anyone in any way. That's what I'm talking about.
Cool. Right, now you said something about 10 minutes ago, about 15 minutes ago, where you said you don't think it's wise for African Caribbeans, and even, let's say, because after African Caribbean, it's Bangladeshis who are most vulnerable to contracting COVID-19. For a Bangladeshi, he's twice more likely, it's twice or 4 times more likely than a white person to contract COVID-19. And you said you don't think it's wise to be having mass gatherings in the UK, given the way the pandemic has affected black and minority ethnic communities. Why is that, bruv? Because people are going to be like, right, how's Loki saying that?
Okay, so the reality is that having close... I don't disagree with the idea of the protest happening. The protest can happen, but what they can do is there can be... And, you know, I'm not... It's just an idea. I'm thinking out loud. People could protest in a way that sets up a lot of distance between each person, and they're able to do flash mobs, they're able to do stuff in different places. It doesn't have to be this dense, close proximity between human beings, because what that can unfortunately lead to is...
Bruv, that's hard, man.
Where
hard.
The government... I agree with you. Of course it is. But the government can blame a second wave on what has already happened.
Yeah.
They can say, yes, it's disproportionately affecting black people, and it's disproportionately affecting Pakistanis and Bengalis, not because those people are more likely to live in overcrowded housing, statistically, not because those people are more likely to work in jobs that endanger them, like a security guard or a cab driver.
Yeah.
Statistically, it's because of these protests. Secondly, what they can do is increase surveillance upon these communities on the basis of that. What they can also do is retroactively arrest people for violating social distance stuff. And so I'm just saying.
No, both those are valid points.
It would be wrong for me as somebody now in my 30s, okay, to invite people to risk themselves in a situation that I'm not directly I can raise the stakes on that quite easily online. I could quite easily say everybody should be doing this, everybody should be doing this, go and burn down this, I'm not going to pay the price for it. I'm not. I already because of what I've done have my own problems with surveillance and all the rest of it. But if I'm inviting young people that still have their lives ahead of them to take a road which can lead to many different places, I'm not going to be there with them. I'm not going to be there with them in the cells. I'm not going to be there with them when they go back and potentially make a member of their family ill because they're asymptomatic. No, we need to think logically and clearly about this. We can't go from a situation where people are asking for more lockdown, which has the economic repercussions which we've already spoken about.
Yeah.
And then say all of a sudden, no, it's okay, everyone get on the street. I agree, the issues are already there. Hence the difference in the disproportionate representation of people we've just mentioned in the death toll, right? Those issues are already there that need to be challenged and mobilized over a long period. Yes, with clear aims. All of that needs to happen. But at this particular time, it's a very, very difficult moment to be doing that. And there was a study that looked into, there was a study that looked into the 15 major pandemics that had hit Europe. They started with the Black Death in the 1300s and went all the way to the flu following the Spanish flu following World War I, which killed more people than died in the war. And what they found is that in terms of economic recovery for an investment which followed those periods, you were looking at serious economic damage that in some cases lasted 30 to 50 years. So what kind of situation are we going to be walking into following this?
Cream.
There's a good direction and there's a bad direction. And what worries me is that the logic behind the bad direction is already there.
I have
Sorry, bro, go ahead.
I have to ask you something, right? And it's something which, no doubt, there's going to be people, viewers and listeners who have followed your work since day dot. There's going to be others who may not know much about your work and things that you rapped about, etc., and in terms of your political punditry. But it seems a consistent thing that you keep referring back to economics and austerity, or you know, looking at a kind of a web of things from that perspective. Why is that, Akhi?
Because it dominates so many things about our lives. If we look at, for instance, the ostensibly following the bailout of the banks in 2010, you had a situation where Royal Bank of Scotland is supposedly nationalised and owned by the British public, right? But the logic behind it, pardon me, is still the same logic that would operate towards a private company. It's still beholden to its shareholders more than in any way it is beholden to public ownership. And so the point is that you can actually, there's a great book called The Equality Effect by Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford, where he looks at the disparity between the richest and the poorest in society. Okay? Now, prior to World War One, you had a situation where the top 1% of the population took 20% of the national income. Okay? Now, what happened was, following World War One, you would have to have a state which would have more obligations, because it became a war economy, more obligations towards the population. So obviously, 1914 to 1918, Britain went from occupying 12,700,000 miles of the globe to occupying 14 million miles of the globe. 14 million miles of the globe. So what happened, by the way, was Britain was able to afford a more equitable division of its national income amongst the population. And what you steadily move towards a situation in the early 70s where you had the top 1% of the society taking 6% of national income and 4% after tax. Okay? Now, at that point, when you have the top 1% taking a smaller portion of the national income, the levels of social ills are lower, levels of depression are lower, people's health is better. Generally, people are happier within the society. However, when you move to the position we're at now, where the top 1% of the society takes 17% of national income, okay, what that means is that we, in terms of disparity, not in terms of quality of life, let's be clear, quality of life has risen substantially from pre-World War One situation. However, the disparity between the richest and the poorest means that you will have greater unhappiness. You actually have rising infant mortality. And that was Theresa May's government. You had that. You had rising general, the life expectancy getting lower. And all of that is because this disparity is smaller, and you have a society more defined by scarcity, more defined by antagonism between people in different positions socially. And so the reason why I focus on economics to answer your question is that it is that dominates the stratification of society. And if you want a more socially just society, then you can have a society which economically is arranged slightly differently.
Cool. So on the issue of the way BAME communities have been affected by the COVID-19 in the UK, right? And we've already seen that African Caribbeans are being disproportionately stopped and fined from these new COVID-19 laws. We see that there was no hoo-ha about Victory Day street celebrations or people going to the beaches who are predominantly white folk, you know, enjoying their bank holiday beach breaks. But there's been a focus on communities and areas in the UK which is predominantly ethnic minority communities. We see that there's been a huge advertising campaign about telling Muslims to stay at home for Eid and stuff like this. And but the same thing wasn't there for Victory Day celebrations. We also know there's been introduction of new laws, laws which clearly are very draconian in their nature. You briefly mentioned to it in terms of trace and testing, as well as the fact that, you know, there's going to be apps now looking to follow people's movements. How does this all fit into the existing security apparatus that we already have in the UK? Perhaps somewhat different to the US, but nevertheless, at its basis, the same in the way it targets Muslims, African Caribbeans, from a position of distrust and surveillance.
Well, I think all of that is definitely going to intensify. It gives it the justification to intensify it further in the name of public health. I think if you look at Henry Jackson Society as quite a good, you know, because Prevent was something that was lobbied for by Student Rights, which was the organisation which was...
a front for Henry Jackson Society.
Say that again, brother?
Yeah. The Student Rights was basically a front for the HJS, wasn't it?
Exactly, and the social, the Centre for Social Cohesion.
Yeah.
So that these organisations are ahead of the curve. What they exist with that symbiotic relationship where they create the stories and they feed them to the media who reproduce them uncritically.
Absolutely.
And then they use those stories to send them to politicians.
Absolutely.
Who then say, oh, well,
Yep.
we're reacting to public demand.
Yep.
Okay, now if you look at where Henry Jackson Society are going with it and where others who are linked to a Trump-ish agenda, it's linked to escalating things with China. Now, what that will undoubtedly lead to is increased surveillance of Chinese people here, but also increased attacks on the streets of Chinese people here too. So I think Islamophobia as the dominant racism in our society is here to stay for a while. But I think things are going to take interesting different turns. And it's important to be conscious of those things.
I want to ask you something. Since you mentioned the way that Henry Jackson Society of late has been going after China and producing that kind of war-type rhetoric that they have previously done, because these guys survive off war. Yeah, I've said it straight. I said to one of their people on the BBC Live show, I said, look, without war, you'd be out of a job. Quite frankly, it was a
fantastic.
It was a Hadouken that had to get dropped. I looked at her squarely in the eye. Her name forgot her name, Emily something, but she's gone because they all move around this kind of circuit of think tanks, right? I said, look, without war, you would not have a job, and that's the truth of it. So since they're drumming they're drumming the beats of war now, yeah, against the Chinese, where does that put Muslims who are seeing what China is doing to the Uyghurs?
The Uyghurs.
Yeah?
Yeah, 100%.
What position, what awkward position does that put Muslims in terms of remaining firm and persistent on and consistent on the issue of adl and justice, where okay, fine, we want China, we know what China's doing to our brothers and sisters up in Xinjiang and East Turkestan, but at the same time, we know that they're going to come after Chinese people here unfairly. What would your advice be to the Muslim community in terms of if they find themselves in that situation?
I think it's possible to be critical of both things at the same time. I don't think it has to be, as somebody such as yourself, with the experience that you have, you're not about to cheerlead for a new projection of mainly the US, but Britain would go along with it, military power. But at the same time, it's about being critical about the sources we're getting information from. It's about being aware of people like the Henry Jackson Society are so amazing because they are taken every single time they speak anywhere in the news. It's as if they're experts.
Yeah.
They're experts.
Yeah, it's crazy.
They haven't, not one. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because they literally, none of them speak Arabic. Um,
And they're all experts,
None of
bruv.
them have studied
They're
this
all
stuff.
experts, bruv.
And they're all experts, which is amazing. You know, something that people have given 40 to 50 years of their life studying. These guys come in and and just think they're... But that's what it is. Exactly as you said, it's an attachment to the war industry. And so I think, yeah, it's about... Both things are possible. You know, you don't have to view the world in a very simplistic black or white way. You know, you don't have to say it's about good and evil, because it's not. It's about states have political interests. The one China policy is established. It means that people that have any type of independent or national aspirations around it suffer and are subject to... I mean, seriously, you know, this is the other thing, is even looking at the COVID-19 thing, I personally would not want to live in... You know, the death toll in a lot of other places was a lot lower. But in terms of the monitoring and the state surveillance that was necessary in order to do that, I wouldn't be happy with giving the state that level of power. So I think it's about thinking critically about those things, bro. But yeah, it will put people in a difficult situation, as often these things do, man. Bringing
the podcast to a close and concluding with a topic which I know is very dear to your heart, dear to my heart, and dear to the hearts of, I would say, 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. And that's the issue of Palestine, right? Now, in 2019, last February, you spoke at Oxford and you said basically that the Arab world hasn't given up on Palestine or hasn't failed Palestine. Do you know the Oxford talk that I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Now, do you make a distinction between regimes and rulers and the awam? Is that essentially... Is that a distinction that you make?
So what I would say is that, number one, if we look at the argument that there is something biologically in common between all Arabs, we would see that no geneticist would support this idea. You have the first mentioning of people that seem to be Arabs by Shalom al-Nasr, who was an Assyrian king in the 800s BC. Where he's talking about this group of people that he refers to as Araba. You had Babylonian references to this group of people, Persian references to this group of people, Greek records also show that this group of people were around, but the Romans generally referred to them as Saracens. And so what that meant is that when the British started coming into contact with these people, it was only in the 18th century when they changed from referring to them as Saracens to referring to them as Arabs. What does bond people together is a shared linguistic origin, which it depends. You know, people say that Arabic in many ways inherited a lot of its habits in terms of communication from Ugaritic, from Phoenicians, from other civilizations that came before it. What ties all of those people together? Now, I don't think actually that people should feel necessarily that Arabs should be more expected to be supportive of the Palestinians because of biology, but they are because of culture, because of language, because of religious significance of Al-Aqsa, because of history. And so that puts us in a situation where you have populations that, you know, even if you were to look at, say, Saudi official records, they would say that 190 Saudi soldiers died in 1948, 13 died in 1967, and 36 died in 1973. Their official discourse would be that they are not betraying the cause by supporting what Trump is pushing forward as the sort of Arab initiative and tacit support for the annexation of the rest of Palestine. You know, 8,000 Bengalis volunteered to fight for the PLO in the 70s.
Yeah.
So you have a situation where people from all over the world support the Palestinians and want to help them in their situation. They see that they are muhasireen, they are besieged, they are driven to different corners of the world where they have less rights than the people in the states in which they live. You know, the fact is in Lebanon, you have 4 generations of Palestinians who face horrific discrimination within Lebanese society. That doesn't mean, you know, there's a saying, التعميم يقتل التحليل. To generalize, you're just killing the ability to analyze. So we can't say across the board that all Arabs stand with Palestinians. To be honest, the argument that I made in that debate was seeing what they were attempting to do, because the implication in their premise was that Arabs had failed Palestinians by not subjugating themselves before Israel, by not kneeling to what Israel wants them to do. So my argument, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, خلاص, finish your point.
So my argument is that the governments that have been dealing with the Israelis for all of these years are Arabic-speaking representatives of the 0.1%. They don't represent the feelings of their populations. People naturally feel that they should defend Palestinians.
So you are making a distinction. You are making a distinction between the rulers in the region and the Awam. You are.
That's correct. Yes, okay. That is correct. But the distinction is important because what they're attempting to do is use this discourse, and also this idea of the Arab world is not necessarily something that I completely go along with. But the polls showed that 91% of people in Arabic-speaking countries said that Israel is the greatest threat to their security.
Yep.
Why do they have that? They have that because Israel has a well-established assassination program, which has visited countries all over the world, including Europe.
Yep.
They say it because Israel has invaded every single country it borders with, because it refuses to define its own borders. It's bombed Sudan, it's bombed Syria, it's bombed Iraq within the last 5 years or so. So we are talking about a situation where the elites of these countries are being forced to accept an orthodoxy which is servility towards Israeli interests, and those elites will benefit from it in terms of exchange of information, in terms of military technology, in terms of different business interests. Those elites would benefit from such arrangements, and most of the countries around it have tacit agreements with the Israelis, and have since 1948, since 1967. They have had to have some form of negotiation with the Israelis. But one of the things that I always take umbrage with is this idea that Palestinian armed resistance is across the board rejected by the whole international community. It is, if you take what the US government, which ostensibly represents 328 million people, and the UK government, which represents 66 million people, what they say, Palestinian armed resistance, despite the fact the UN resolutions assert that it is legal in international law, say that this is completely, it's out of bounds. It's not a question. You don't have the option of an armed deterrent towards what the Israelis do. But it's not like Turkey, which their government supposedly represents 79 million people. It's not like they define these same groups as terrorist organizations. The Russian government, which supposedly represents 145 million people, they don't define these organizations as terrorist organizations. Venezuela, 31 million people. Pakistan, 197 million people. Switzerland, which represents almost 9 million people. In terms of the governments that define Palestinian resistance as terrorism, they are representing far less people than the governments that take those organizations as serious political groups. So I think that for countries that speak the same language as the Palestinians are in constant cross-cultural exchanges with them, to be in a rush to define those groups as terrorist organizations, to imprison those groups, and to try and do everything. You know, you had the deputy chief of police in Dubai yesterday or the day before, a few days ago, say there needs to be an Arab invasion of Qatar, and there needs to be a peace agreement between Qatar and Israel. Madness, precisely madness. Because what is happening is people are seeing narrow self-interests of the business and the political elites, and trying to dictate what is public policy. You know, people in 1948 were literally pushing their governments to send them and to go and fight. So the reality is as the old adage goes, they say the old will die and the children will forget. You know, it is our job in an era of prevent where children are being questioned by police for wearing Palestine badges in British schools.
Yeah.
The place where the Balfour Declaration was, you know, it was Chaim Weizmann actually, who was professor at Manchester University, who was able to persuade, for 3 years he spent persuading the British government to issue the Balfour Declaration. And let's not forget that the number one enemy of the publishing of the Balfour Declaration was Edwin Montagu, who was Jewish himself in Britain. Let's not forget figures like Nathan Birnbaum. You know, this guy was credited with coining the phrase Zionism, and was a Zionist, and later became an anti-Zionist. Let's assert our rights that by supporting Palestinian rights, we are supporting the rights of all people, but also that Zionism in and of itself, and this was one of Edwin Montagu's criticisms of it, he said, by doing this, not only will it necessitate the displacement of the indigenous population, he said it will make Jews in other countries around the world unsafe, because all of a sudden those countries they're in will no longer be their countries. So there's all types of arguments that have to be made. But as I said, the adage goes that the old will die and the children will forget. We have to make sure the children remember, and that the children assert the rights of the Palestinian people where they are, and are eager to learn about it as well, and see it as relevant to them.
Now, of course, you alluded to quite clearly that, you know, you don't necessarily subscribe to the notion of the Arab world per se in the way it's commonly spoken about, and you refer to what's actually meant by the Arab people and so forth. But I'm gonna be frank with you, Kareem, bruv. Yeah, the reason why an Indonesian or a Malaysian or a Bengali or someone in Shishan or in Dagestan or someone as south as Tanzania cares about Palestine is because it's the third holiest site in Islam, because of Masjid al-Aqsa.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I totally reject and have consistently rejected that the issue of Palestine is an Arab cause. I'm not about that. Yeah. Naturally people will gravitate towards that argument because of the neighboring countries and the neighboring lands and governments. I get that. In the same way that when you talk about Kashmir, is very, it's easy to you straight away refer to Pakistan, right? Or if you look at the Rohingya situation, straight away you refer to Bangladesh, right? And so forth. But the point here is many, and I'm talking in the hundreds of millions of Muslims, non-Arab Muslims, feel for Palestine because of Al-Aqsa, right?
Yeah.
So given that, bro, right, there's many Muslims, whether they'll go on record or publicly say it or not, they'll say, look, we can't even recognize a handspan of this country as legitimate, i.e. Israel. We can't. We can't recognize a handspan of giving legitimacy to this state, to this illegal entity. So what would your views then be with regards to when we talk about the two-state solution, whether it be the 48 borders, which is not even on the table, it's really the 67 borders or 73 borders, wouldn't recognizing or working towards a two-state solution essentially give legitimacy to the Israeli entity?
Yeah, 100%. There is no two-state solution. It was a subterfuge for more ethnic cleansing, and it was an example of that optimistic cruelty of the Palestinian corrupt, compromised elite. Definitely the foundation of Israel was, a necessity of it was the demographic balance and changing the demographic balance. You know, there were different strands within Zionism. there was spiritual Zionism that somebody called Martin Buber advocated for, but that movement, which was non-state based, and it was the idea
That died
Jewish
out,
people,
and that didn't get much traction,
well,
right?
it only had a few hundred. It only had a few hundred people
Yeah.
at its height. You had Leo Pinsker, who wrote the Auto-Emancipation pamphlet, which basically argued that Jewish people were, because the nation state is a modern concept, and you had people that had spent a lot of time, like Pinsker, like Herzl, and spent a lot of time trying to assimilate within the societies they came from, and found it very, very difficult. You know, they both were quite successful in those societies, but things happened which led them to see their own positions as more precarious than they would like. And they looked at the modern state and thought, if Jewish people were able to have that, then it would offer, you know, and there's a reading of Theodor Herzl and Leo Pinsker, which says that they were pinned to quite themselves anti-Jewish feelings, and these are the figureheads of Zionism. You know, they talked about Jewish people in human ways, and the ways in which Jewish people could be humanized, according to these guys, a certain reading of their work, attest that statehood is what would deliver them to full humanhood. But they were also, Leo Pinsker himself was not Palestine-centric in his Zionism. So it was a state. It could have been, you know, let's not forget that the British government at one point, not long before Theodor Herzl died, offered
Uganda?
You know, there was talk of Argentina, there was talk of Uganda, and Herzl initially accepted Uganda, actually, but then was opposed massively in the World Zionist Congress, and then died not long after it in 1905. So if you read the Judenstaat by Theodor Herzl, he said, we must spirit the penniless population across the border, and that amounts to the practice of ethnic cleansing. Zionist thinkers in the Yeshuv period, which is the way it's referred to, which itself means settlement. And this was actually one of the reasons why I said that Sultan Abdul Hamid II was naive, was because of his meetings with Theodor Herzl, which...
But he's celebrated, remember, Kareem, he's celebrated for rejecting many of the proposals made to him by Herzl.
But the point I'm going to finish, and I agree that Herzl made a mistake by revealing his hand by going to the Uthmaniyyin and stating that this was the intention, because what it potentially meant is that Jewish settlement that had already been taking place from the 1880s would be something that would be impeded by what he did. And while it is correct that he had 4 meetings, okay? Now, in those 4 meetings, a conversation continued about the possibility of Theodor Herzl being able to pull strings to alleviate and forgive some of the Ottoman
debt. Yeah.
But my point is that during that process, the build-up of settlements was taking place. And yes, there are, and it's true, there are those that say, because of people fellaheen particularly, trying to avoid conscription, they allowed Palestinian urbanites to have land ownership, and in some cases Lebanese people to have land ownership of swaths of Palestine. And there were instances of land being sold by landowners who were in cities, of land that was in the countryside. But what there also was, you know, as I'm sure you know, Jewish people enjoyed far greater rights in Ottoman Palestine than in many other parts of Europe at that period.
That had been the case for centuries, bro.
Yeah, so the point is that you had the settlement was able to intensify during that period. So it's for that reason that I would say naive. But many people were naive. You know, it's easy to view things in a teleological way. It's easy to view things in an inevitable way, that this was always going to happen. But the reality is that when things are happening, we have no idea of where things will be politically in 50 years or 40 years. You know, so you can't necessarily be too condemnatory about decisions that were made that now in retrospect appear to have been pretty terrible decisions. But I'm not sure why I went down this this route. But in terms of the development of the Zionist movement, there was consensus among both sides of it as it developed from the Jabotinsky side and the Ben-Gurion side. The Ben-Gurion side, which he was also trained in the British Army. Jabotinsky was trained in the British Army. One side of it believed they would get their state off the back of British tanks, and the other side believed in confrontation with the British. One side of it believed, and and this was an unfortunate thing about the political climate in this country, it didn't allow us to have a real discussion and interrogation of the very real political decisions that were made by elements within the Zionist movement vis-a-vis Germany in the 30s particularly, and even as late as the 41, Stern Gang sent a letter to the Nazi government saying they would enter the war on the side of the Nazis. This is the Stern Gang. This is a terrorist group that was killing British soldiers and was killing Palestinians also. So the thing is there was, despite these differences between the two sides, consensus that the Palestinians were the indigenous people. And in terms of Al-Aqsa, one way in which I think we should not forget, because while we should be aware of limitations that exist, we should also not be afraid to big up and emphasize victories that were had. There would be metal detectors on Al-Aqsa right now if it was not for the civil disobedience which blocked the Israelis from being able to do that. So while the digging is going on underneath it, while settler groups are being funded by the Israeli government and regularly going in, and their passage is being facilitated by Israeli soldiers, the resistance is always there. The resistance.
Just to conclude, right, and this is a concluding note, and I do want your brief notes on this. Do you feel that it's a fair and just mindset to have amongst Muslims, irrelevant of race, irrelevant of nationality, that they simply will not accept any type of Zionist entity?
Yeah, completely. Completely, bro.
Yeah. Good.
100%.
Alhamdulillah.
100%. I subscribe to the same position. I subscribe to the same position. And the reality is that people are being bullied quite easily into a position where they say, if Benny Morris, right, can say that displacement and ethnic cleansing was necessary for the foundation of Israel, then why can we not say that Zionism is racism in that way? If from the advocates of the cause make clear, Jabotinsky, who has more streets in Israel, quote unquote, the state of Israel, named after him than any other human being, said very clearly, what we are doing can only exist against the clenched teeth of the indigenous people of this place. So, it's we are not alone.
Okay. My brother, enough love for this, man. It's been a good conversation, akhi, man. Wallahi, I've...
Thanks, bro. I was very long-winded.
No. You need, everyone knows that Loki's long-winded, and it's a beneficial long-windedness, man. No, that was deep. Kareem, enough love for that, my brother. It was an honor. It was an honor having you on, bruv.
No, it's an honor to be on, bro. Thank you for having me, man. And we'll talk more, bro.
No, most definitely. Look after yourself, brother, and keep us in your prayers, man.
You too, my bro.
Okay.
My salama. Take care.
Wa alaikum salam. Brothers and sisters, I hope you enjoyed that very in-depth podcast. Please subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. There was a lot to take in, a lot to think about, and I guess the 13-month wait to have Loki on was worth the wait. I know many of you were waiting for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you benefit from it. And most importantly, I hope you reflect upon many of the issues that we discussed. For those of you in North America, please subscribe to the Mad Mumlux channel and go onto their podcast platforms to listen to this podcast. Everyone else, subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Click that bell notification. Leave a comment, like the video, share the video, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Blood Brothers Podcast. A 5 Pillars of Mad Monolith production.